People used to eat their wedding dinner out of an actual toilet pot. And that is somehow not even the strangest thing on this list. Medieval weddings were pure chaos. A man could grab his buddies, kidnap a woman, and legally call it a marriage. Guests chucked heavy shoes straight at the newlyweds' heads for good luck. You could accidentally marry someone just by sharing one sip of wine with the wrong person. We dug up 111 of the dumbest, weirdest, most unhinged wedding traditions in history, and by the end, you will be thanking your spouse for being so beautifully boring. So smash that like button, comment which one nearly made you faint, and subscribe before I legally bind you to a stranger over a goblet of wine. Let us get into it. 1. Imagine throwing a wedding where the guests flat out refused to leave the bedroom. In medieval times, noble newlyweds got physically stripped down by their own wedding guests and tucked into bed while the entire crowd stood there watching. The cousins watched, the neighbors watched, and grandma probably brought snacks. Everybody demanded visual proof the marriage was real and complete, so the terrified couple just laid there while 100 strangers stared. Basically, the worst sleepover in history. 2. Here is a job nobody applied for. Medieval doctors actually inspected a bride's morning pee to confirm she was a virgin before the wedding. They had official guidebooks telling them to hunt for clear, white, or sparkling hues swirling in the cup. The doctor squinted at the urine like a sommelier judging fine wine, nodding seriously while the anxious family waited. And somehow, an entire marriage hinged on whether a man thought the bride's bathroom break looked shiny enough. 3. Before a couple could enjoy their wedding night, a priest came to bless the bed first. And he did not come alone. A full procession of chanting townspeople marched directly into the bedroom and sprinkled holy water all over the sheets. The couple stood there awkwardly while strangers soaked their mattress and mumbled prayers at the pillows. Only after the entire singing parade shuffled back out could the newlyweds finally enjoy their now slightly damp, very public bed. 4. That sweet phrase, giving away the bride, sounds romantic until you learn the dark truth. Back then, women were legally treated like a literal piece of real estate. A father handing his daughter to a groom was basically transferring property from one man to another, like signing over a parcel of land. The bride had about the same legal say as a barn. Dad shook hands. The deed changed owners, and everybody pretended this counted as a beautiful, loving moment. 5. Some absolute scoundrels figured out a shortcut to trick women into bed. They would grab a few blades of flimsy grass, twist them into a fake ring, and slide it onto a young woman's finger as a joke. To her, it looked like a real proposal. To him, it was a loophole to sleep with her, then vanish. She thought she was engaged while he was already halfway out the door, leaving behind nothing but a wilting grass ring. 6. You could get legally married while completely hammered at the local bar. No church, no priest, no paperwork required. A peasant just had to say, "I take you as my husband or wife" out loud in a crowded tavern, and boom, bound forever. The drunk regulars nearby became your official witnesses. Picture some guy waking up the next morning with a pounding headache, looking at a stranger and slowly realizing the whole pub remembers him legally committing his entire life away over ale. 7. Wedding garters used to be a full contact sport. Drunk guests genuinely believed owning a piece of the bride's clothing brought good luck, so they would tackle her right at the altar. They swarmed and yanked at her garter belt like linebackers chasing a fumble. The poor bride basically got dogpiled in her own wedding dress while the priest watched in horror. Grooms eventually started ripping the garter off themselves and chucking it to the crowd just to stop the stampede. 8. Imagine getting married and then being legally banned from your own honeymoon. If a couple's wedding landed during a holy fasting period, they were forbidden from sleeping together for exactly 40 days. 40. The newlyweds were locked into a frustrating waiting game enforced by the church while the calendar slowly mocked them. They could share a house, share meals, share everything except the one thing newlyweds actually want. Picture two people staring at the ceiling for over a month, just counting down. 9. Brides used to deliberately rip out their own hairlines for beauty. The ultimate medieval bridal standard was a massive, gleaming, exposed forehead. The bigger the better. So women plucked their hair back several inches, yanking it out strand by strand to create the most enormous 5-head possible. The more scalp you showed, the more gorgeous everybody thought you were. Brides walked down the aisle proudly displaying a forehead so vast it practically had its own zip code and weather pattern. 10. Plot twist. Real church weddings did not even happen inside the church. The entire ceremony, the vows, the rings, all of it took place outside on the cold stone front porch. The couple stood shivering on the steps exchanging promises while the actual warm building sat right behind them, mostly unused for the main event. Guests crowded onto the porch like they were waiting for a bus. Only after the chilly doorstep ceremony ended did everybody finally head inside. 11. The morning after the wedding came with the most humiliating show and tell imaginable. The bride's own family would march into the bedroom, snatch the used bed sheets, and proudly parade them through the village to prove her purity. Neighbors leaned out windows, nodding in approval at the laundry. The poor couple just watched their most private moment become public evidence flapping in the breeze. Nothing says welcome to the family quite like Grandpa waving your dirty sheets at the entire town. 12. When legal disputes got messy, things got deeply uncomfortable for the bride. Court-appointed older women called matrons would physically examine a woman's body to determine if she was legally old enough to marry. These official inspectors poked and prodded, looking for evidence while judges waited for the verdict. Imagine the most awkward government job ever, where strangers decide your wedding date by squinting at your body. The bride had no say, just a panel of grandmas filing their official report. 13. Early British newlyweds got the most disgusting wedding meal in history. Friends would mash together beer, flour, and coins into a lumpy gray sludge, then serve it inside a literal toilet pot. Yes, a chamber pot, the thing people peed in. The happy couple was expected to eat this revolting stew right out of the bathroom bucket while everybody cheered. Picture digging your spoon into a pee bucket on your wedding day, while your relatives clap and call it tradition. 14. Elite marriages had absolutely nothing to do with love and everything to do with dirt. Among the wealthy, weddings were pure business mergers, where fathers traded enormous acres of land for political and military alliances. The bride and groom were basically signatures on a real estate deal. Two old men shook hands over a map, swapped some fields, and accidentally created a marriage. The couple barely mattered. They were just the staples holding the property contract together. 15. In medieval Scotland, dating could mean getting straight-up kidnapped. A man who wanted a wife would simply gather his buddies, storm a woman's home, and physically drag her away to force a legal union. No proposal, no dinner, just a group abduction with marriage paperwork attached. The woman went from washing dishes to legally married in a single terrifying afternoon. Romance back then apparently meant a man and his friends treating courtship like a smash and grab robbery. 16. The Catholic Church basically ran a strict scheduling system for the bedroom. Couples were flat out banned from being intimate on Sundays, Thursdays, and Fridays for spiritual purity reasons. So, newlyweds had to consult the calendar like they were booking a dentist appointment. Half the week was simply off limits by holy decree. Picture a couple lying in bed, checking what day it is, realizing it's Thursday, and just sighing because the church said absolutely not tonight. 17. White wedding dresses were not even a thing yet. Before white took over, blue was the hottest bridal color around because it represented the Virgin Mary and pure modesty. Brides proudly draped themselves in blue to show the whole village how wholesome and respectable they were. So every medieval wedding basically looked like a sea of bridesmaids who all forgot to coordinate. The bride stood there glowing in blue, broadcasting her purity through her fashion choices to everyone watching. 18. Some Germanic tribes had a brutal makeover waiting for the bride. On her wedding morning, a woman's long, beautiful hair would be violently sheared into a bald, monk-like spot to signify her total submission. She walked into the day with flowing locks and walked out looking like she lost a fight with the village barber. The groom apparently found this attractive. Nothing screams happy marriage like forcing your new wife to debut a brand new involuntary haircut. 19. Medieval law had a wild relationship upgrade glitch. If an engaged couple simply got intimate before the actual wedding, the law instantly bumped them up to fully married status, no ceremony required. One private moment and congratulations, you skipped the entire wedding and went straight to legally bound. Couples basically married themselves by accident. Picture two engaged people realizing they fast-forwarded their whole relationship without meaning to, now permanently wed because of one impatient evening they did not plan out. 20. Before fancy wedding cakes existed, the bride got assaulted with bread. Roman and early medieval tradition demanded that a hard loaf of barley bread be smashed violently right over the bride's skull. The harder the whack, the more good luck and fertility it supposedly brought. So her big day started with a face full of crumbs and a ringing headache. Guests cheered as someone clobbered the bride with a baguette, treating her head like a fertility piñata. 21. The reception came with a hostage situation involving footwear. The bride's family would sneak around and steal the groom's shoes, then refuse to give them back until he bought beer for the entire village. Suddenly, the groom was barefoot, broke, and negotiating with his in-laws over his own sneakers. The whole town stood there grinning, holding his shoes hostage until the drinks flowed. Nothing builds a marriage like extorting the groom for booze while he hops around with no shoes on. 22. Fathers back then had a horrifying method for approving suitors. Violent physical intimidation was widely used to force young daughters into accepting elderly, wealthy men they absolutely did not want. The girl said no, dad raised a fist, and suddenly, she was engaged to a man 4 times her age. Love had nothing to do with it, just money and muscle. Picture a terrified teenager being threatened into marrying a wrinkly old baron because he owned a really nice estate. 23. Medieval couples had 2 giant chunks of the year where romance was completely outlawed by holiday rules. During Lent and the weeks before Christmas, intimacy was banned, so the church basically turned the most festive seasons into total dead zones. While modern folks associate Christmas with cozy snuggling, back then it meant a hard no from the priest. Imagine decorating for the holidays knowing the calendar itself forbids any honeymoon vibes. The season of giving apparently gave couples absolutely nothing but a long, frustrating wait. 24. Runaway couples who fled to Scotland got married by a blacksmith of all people. At Gretna Green, the local blacksmith would strike his anvil with a hammer to symbolically pound the couple's souls together forever. No priest, no church, just a sweaty, muscular man banging hot metal to seal your eternal love. The clang of the anvil was basically the medieval version of saying, "I now pronounce you." Couples drove for miles just to get welded together by a guy in an apron. 25. The garter-grabbing mobs got so out of control that grooms invented an escape plan. To stop drunk guests from tackling the bride, the groom started tearing the garter off himself and hurling it out the window to the crowd outside. The mob would scramble in the dirt fighting over the little fabric prize while the couple slammed the window shut. It was basically crowd control through distraction, like tossing a chew toy to wild dogs so they leave you alone. 26. Royal parents were signing marriage contracts before the kids could even exist. Nobles frequently arranged legal weddings for children who were still floating around inside the womb, completely unborn. So 2 pregnant bellies were essentially engaged before anyone knew if they were having boys or girls. The babies arrived already committed to a stranger they would meet years later. Picture being born and immediately learning your entire romantic future was decided while you were still a tiny kicking blob. 27. Medieval couples got a special pre-bedtime potion to spice things up. They were served a thick, heavily spiced hot wine called hippocras right before bed to supposedly stimulate their humors and boost fertility. So the wedding night began with chugging a steaming mug of medieval energy drink. The whole village basically believed this mulled wine was a love potion. Picture 2 nervous newlyweds gulping down hot spiced booze, waiting for the magic, while their relatives winked knowingly from just outside the bedroom door. 28. Royal brides wore dresses so heavy they could barely function. Their gowns were woven with real gold threads, making them weigh an absolute ton. So much that 2 servants had to help the bride simply stand up. She basically wore a wearable bank vault down the aisle. Walking became a team sport, with attendants hoisting her upright like a fallen knight in armor. The richer the bride, the heavier the dress, until she was less of a person and more of a chandelier. 29. Medieval justice had one of the darkest loopholes imaginable. Women who were attacked were frequently forced by judges to marry their own attacker, all to protect the family's precious reputation. So the victim was sentenced to a lifetime with the very man who harmed her, just to keep the village gossip quiet. The court called this a tidy solution. There was no justice for her at all, only a horrifying ruling that traded her entire future for the family's public image. 30. After giving birth, a new mother was treated like she carried a curse. A husband was legally banned from sleeping with his wife for exactly 40 days after delivery because she was considered spiritually unclean. So she just survived labor, and her reward was being labeled contaminated by the church. The poor, exhausted woman recovered alone while everyone treated her like a temporary biohazard. Picture a new mom rolling her eyes as the priest declares her untouchable for another 40 long days. 31. Some medieval rings took a scenic tour before reaching the right finger. The groom would slide the ring down the bride's thumb first while chanting holy names, then move it along before finally parking it on the correct finger. It was like a tiny finger road trip with religious narration. Each stop got its own mumbled prayer. Picture a nervous groom slowly inching a ring across his bride's hand while a priest chants, treating one simple ring placement like a sacred obstacle course. 32. Churches were secretly stockpiling weapons right under the wedding altar. Hidden beneath the holy table sat axes and swords, ready for the moment the bride's family showed up to violently rescue her. So, the most sacred spot in the building doubled as a weapons locker. The priest could literally bless the couple with one hand and reach for a battle axe with the other. Nothing says holy matrimony like knowing there is an armory stashed under the flowers in case things turn into a brawl. 33. Getting married meant surviving 3 weeks of public roasting first. The church required your marriage to be announced out loud on 3 separate Sundays, called the banns, and anyone in the village could stand up and object. So your wedding basically had a built-in heckling period. Old grudges came flying out. Picture a couple sweating through 3 straight Sundays, praying nobody's bitter ex or angry cousin leaps up mid-service to dramatically expose some secret and torpedo the whole engagement. 34. In parts of Scotland, friends celebrated your engagement by absolutely ruining you. They would capture the couple before the wedding and smother them in fish guts, sour milk, and various foul slop, all to scare away demons. So the happy pair spent the days before their wedding reeking like a dumpster behind a seafood market. The worse you smelled, the safer you supposedly were. Picture a bride covered in rotten fish, gagging, while her friends insist this disgusting mess is keeping evil spirits far away. 35. Grooms back then could literally demand a refund on their own wife. If a man discovered his bride was not a virgin, he could legally march back to his father-in-law and request his cash back like he was returning a faulty product. The bride was treated like merchandise with a money-back guarantee. Imagine the most awkward conversation ever. A groom complaining to his new dad-in-law about damaged goods while demanding a partial reimbursement on the entire marriage deal. 36. When a rich nobleman died, his orphaned daughters became items at a royal yard sale. The king would literally auction off the marriage rights to those young women, selling them to whichever lord coughed up the most money. So a grieving daughter would discover her hand in marriage was being sold to the highest bidder by the crown itself. There was no romance, just a bidding war. Picture lords waving their coin purses, competing to purchase a stranger's daughter like she was prime farmland. 37. The church had one rule about intimacy, and it was a real buzzkill. The only legally acceptable reason to be together was making babies, and doing it purely for fun was officially classified as a sin. So couples were expected to approach the bedroom like a serious reproductive task, not anything enjoyable. Smiling was practically against the rules. Picture 2 newlyweds being reminded by the priest that pleasure is forbidden, and this whole thing is strictly a baby manufacturing assignment. 38. Couples shared one of the simplest sweet rituals using a single piece of bread. The bride and groom would dip one hard crust into a wine goblet, eat it together, and then drink the leftover wine to seal their union. It was basically a medieval combo meal for 2. One soggy crust in a shared cup, and boom, you were spiritually bonded. Picture 2 newlyweds passing a single wine-soaked breadcrumb back and forth like it was the most romantic snack ever invented. 39. Peasant winter weddings happened in the most absurd location possible, directly on top of frozen rivers. Since flat open public space was rare, couples just shuffled out onto the thick ice to exchange their vows. So the entire ceremony took place on a giant sheet of slippery frozen water. One wrong step, and the bride could go ice skating into the priest. Picture an entire shivering village balancing carefully on a river, praying the ice holds long enough to finish the wedding. 40. There was a strange reason brides always stood on the left side of the altar. Medieval science seriously taught that Eve was created from Adam's left rib, so the bride had to plant herself on the left to honor that origin story. Nobody questioned the rib logic, they just lined up accordingly. So every single wedding featured a bride parked to the left because of some ancient anatomy theory. Picture a couple shuffling into position based entirely on a confusing biblical rib calculation. 41. Before wedding cakes existed, guests played a dessert-based balancing game. They would stack small spiced buns into the tallest pile possible, then dare the couple to kiss over the mound without toppling it. If the newlyweds smooched successfully without knocking the tower down, they were destined to be rich. So their entire financial future rested on a wobbly stack of pastries. Picture two people leaning in carefully over a sketchy bun tower, sweating, knowing one clumsy bump means a lifetime of being broke. 42. Poor village brides had a clever workaround so they would not look totally broke. They would pool their pennies together and rent a single brass crown from the church, sharing it between all the local brides. So one cheap shiny crown got passed around the village like a community library book. Every bride got her turn to feel fancy before handing it back. Picture a bride proudly wearing a rented crown, fully aware the same headpiece sat on 3 other heads that same month. 43. Medieval marriage came with a legal rule that aged horribly. A husband was fully permitted to physically strike his wife with a stick if she dared to disobey his household rules. The law literally backed the beating, treating it like routine discipline. So a wife voicing an opinion could legally end with her husband reaching for a rod. There was no protection for her at all, just a grim system that handed men a stick and called it keeping order in the home. 44. The church had a truly bizarre ranking of sins involving lonely men. Medieval guides actually taught that it was a lesser sin for a man to visit a worker than to handle his own urges privately by himself. So, according to the church math, paying a stranger was somehow more forgivable than a solo evening at home. The logic made absolutely no sense, yet priests preached it seriously. Picture a confused medieval man doing moral arithmetic, trying to figure out which option damns him less. 45. When an old man married a young girl, the whole village turned into a noisy mob of critics. They would gather outside the couple's window banging pots, pans, and anything loud to publicly mock the ridiculous age gap. This rowdy shaming party was called a charivari, so the wrinkly groom and his teenage bride got serenaded by an angry kitchen orchestra. Picture an elderly man trying to enjoy his wedding night while the entire town clangs spoons outside, loudly judging his life choices. 46. Couples in poor remote marshlands could not afford metal rings, so they got crafty with whatever grew nearby. They simply wove their wedding bands out of raw hemp rope when actual rings were nowhere to be found. So their eternal symbol of love was basically a tiny knot of scratchy plant fiber. The rings probably frayed within a week. Picture a groom proudly sliding a rough little rope loop onto his bride's finger, both pretending the itchy hemp ring counts as precious jewelry. 47. Grooms stayed battle-ready throughout the entire wedding ceremony. They deliberately kept their right hand completely free during the vows so they could yank out a sword if a rival tried to kidnap the bride mid-wedding. So while the couple exchanged loving promises, the groom was secretly prepared to start swinging steel. Romance and combat blended into one tense event. Picture a groom whispering sweet vows with one hand hovering near his blade, fully expecting some jealous enemy to crash the altar at any second. 48. The bridal veil was not invented for fashion at all. It was basically demon armor. Returning. Crusaders introduced the veil specifically to physically hide the bride from evil entities lurking around the ceremony. So that delicate piece of fabric was actually a supernatural disguise meant to confuse demons. The bride was essentially wearing a ghost repellent over her face. Picture a couple convinced that a thin sheet of cloth was the only thing standing between their wedding and an actual demonic ambush. 49. In peasant villages, a woman's romantic value was measured entirely in livestock. A bride's worth was directly calculated by how many healthy dairy cows her father was willing to toss into the marriage deal. So the more cows, the more desirable she became. Suitors basically evaluated a wife like she came with a herd attached. Picture a father bragging about his daughter by listing her cow count, while the groom nods approvingly, mentally calculating how much milk this marriage will produce. 50. Escaping a terrible husband was nearly impossible thanks to a brutal legal twist. Running away from an abusive marriage was literally treated as stealing his property because the wife counted as his belongings. So, a woman fleeing for her safety was hunted down like a thief who robbed a house. The law sided entirely with the husband. Picture a desperate wife sprinting toward freedom, only for the courts to declare she basically committed grand theft by trying to escape her own miserable life. 51. Medieval couples had to keep one nervous eye on the church calendar at all times. If a random saint's feast day suddenly popped up, they were forced to immediately cancel any private bedroom plans, no exceptions. So a couple could be all cozy and ready, only to realize tomorrow honored some obscure saint nobody had heard of. Boom, plans ruined. Picture two newlyweds flipping through the calendar in a panic, groaning as yet another surprise holy day blocks their evening entirely. 52. Old Celtic couples had a brilliant try before you buy approach to marriage. Through hand fasting, they could literally tie their hands together for exactly 1 year and 1 day as a trial run, before committing forever. If it went badly, they simply walked away when the time expired. So it was basically a medieval relationship test drive. Picture two people bound at the wrist, sharing a whole year together, secretly counting the days to decide if this stranger is keeper material. 53. Wedding guests had a strange way of wishing the couple good luck by chucking laundry at them. They would sit at the foot of the wedding bed and take turns hurling the newlyweds' discarded socks directly at their faces. The first one to land a sock on the right target supposedly got married next. So, the romantic evening began with a barrage of flying footwear. Picture a couple ducking and dodging dirty stockings while their relatives cackle and aim for their heads. 54. Divorce simply did not exist, so unhappy couples had to get sneaky. To escape a marriage, you had to spend years proving it was never legally real, usually by claiming you were secretly distant cousins all along. So, instead of splitting up, people played detective on their own family tree. Picture a miserable couple digging through ancient records, desperately hunting for a shared great-grandparent, just so a court might finally agree their entire marriage was technically an accident. 55. Before rice or flower petals, wedding guests celebrated by launching footwear like weapons. They would aggressively hurl heavy, solid old shoes directly at the newlyweds' heads as a sign of good fortune. So the happy couple walked away bruised, dodging a storm of flying boots. The harder the shoe, the luckier the toss, apparently. Picture a bride and groom sprinting for cover while their loving guests pelt them with leather projectiles, treating the wedding exit like a medieval dodgeball match. 56. White wedding dresses would have looked downright poor to medieval royalty. Top-tier nobles wore deep blood red or dark purple velvet instead, specifically to scream their extreme wealth to everyone watching. The richer you were, the bolder and darker the color. So a royal bride basically wore her bank account on her body. Picture a queen gliding down the aisle in dramatic crimson velvet, fully aware that her terrifyingly expensive dress was loudly announcing she could buy the entire village. 57. Women who flat out refused their arranged marriages had exactly one escape route. Their only option was to take a vow of poverty and join a convent, locking themselves away as a nun forever. So the choice was simple: marry the stranger dad picked, or trade the whole world for a lifetime of prayer. Picture a defiant young woman crossing her arms, telling her family she would rather become a nun than marry the wrinkly baron they kept shoving in her direction. 58. Medieval couples believed timing their romance wrong could create monsters. Being intimate while the bride was on her cycle was completely outlawed, because they genuinely thought it produced deformed babies. So the calendar in the bedroom doubled as a strict safety manual. Couples lived in fear of accidentally breaking the rule. Picture two newlyweds nervously consulting the days, convinced that one mistimed evening would summon some terrifying creature instead of a healthy child, all based on completely made-up medieval science. 59. Summer brides had a clever trick to survive their own sweaty wedding feasts. They wore wreaths of rosemary dipped in scented water specifically to keep flies and foul body odors away during the hot celebration. So, the lovely floral crown was secretly a medieval air freshener. With no deodorant around, that fragrant garland did some serious heavy lifting. Picture a bride smiling through a packed summer feast, her rosemary wreath bravely battling the combined stench of 100 sweaty, unwashed guests. 60. Newlyweds were not even trusted to eat their first meal alone together. A designated elder would sit directly between the couple at their post-wedding feast to closely monitor their manners and behavior. So instead of a romantic dinner, they got a built-in chaperone wedged between them like a referee. Every bite was being watched. Picture two newlyweds trying to share a sweet moment over dinner, only to find grandma planted firmly in the middle, judging how they hold their spoons. 61. Before the year 1215, the rules on who you could marry were absolutely insane. You were legally banned from marrying anyone who shared even a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent with you. That is so many greats it loops back to confusing. So finding a legal spouse meant tracing your family tree back through centuries of ancestors. Picture a couple deeply in love being told they cannot marry, because some random person 7 generations ago happened to be related, forcing them to scrap the whole wedding. 62. Grooms walked into their weddings with pockets full of seasoning for a strange reason. They would stuff raw salt crystals into their clothing specifically to protect their manhood from being cursed with infertility by jealous neighbors. So the big day involved a man jingling with salt like a walking snack pretzel. He genuinely believed the crystals were a magical shield. Picture a nervous groom patting his salty pockets, fully convinced that a handful of seasoning was the only thing guarding his future children. 63. The wealth gap at weddings was painfully obvious in the fabric. While rich brides floated around in luxurious silk, peasant brides simply wore their everyday coarse cotton church dress because buying a new outfit was financially impossible. So a poor bride basically got married in the same scratchy dress she wore every Sunday. There was no glamorous gown, just regular clothes. Picture a peasant bride standing proudly in her ordinary dress, knowing the silk-wearing rich folks could practically smell her budget from across the room. 64. Marriages among enslaved laborers and serfs could be erased on a single cruel whim. If a master decided to sell one of them away, their entire union was instantly dissolved like it never happened. So two people deeply committed could be ripped apart simply because their owner wanted some quick cash. Their love held zero legal weight. Picture a married couple being torn from each other forever as a master shrugs and pockets the money, treating their marriage like a canceled subscription. 65. When you added up all the holy days, fasts, and bans, the math got depressing fast. The average medieval couple could legally be intimate less than once a week thanks to the endless religious restrictions. So the calendar basically functioned as a relationship cock-blocker on a national scale. Half the year was simply forbidden. Picture two frustrated newlyweds doing the calendar math, slowly realizing the church carved away nearly every available evening they actually had together. 66. To show total submission to the church, some brides had to ditch their shoes entirely. Certain regional customs forced the bride to walk barefoot all the way from her home to the altar porch, regardless of rocks, mud, or freezing ground. So her romantic wedding stroll became a painful obstacle course on bare feet. Comfort was nowhere on the agenda. Picture a bride wincing across cold, sharp ground, stepping in who knows what, just to prove how humble and obedient she truly was. 67. The romantic tradition of carrying a bride over the threshold has a creepy origin. People genuinely believed evil spirits lived under the floorboards, waiting to sneak into the bride through her feet the moment she stepped inside. So the groom hoisted her up purely to keep demons from entering her souls. It was pest control, not romance. Picture a groom heaving his bride through the doorway, sweating, convinced that one wrong step would let a floor demon crawl straight up her leg. 68. Peasant serfs could not even fall in love without paying their landlord first. They were legally blocked from marrying anyone until they handed over a cash fine to their local feudal lord. So before any vows, the couple had to bribe the boss just for permission to be together. Love came with a mandatory cover charge. Picture two serfs counting their tiny pile of coins, scraping together enough to pay the lord, just to earn the basic right to get married. 69. Bridesmaids were not there to look pretty, they were human decoys. They were forced to dress identical to the bride specifically to confuse evil spirits and bitter exes who might want to curse or attack her. So the whole bridal party functioned as a squad of look-alike body doubles. The more identical, the safer the bride supposedly was. Picture a row of matching women standing guard, hoping any lurking demon or jealous former lover gets hopelessly confused about which one to target. 70. The poorest couples could not dream of gold or silver, so their rings were downright rusty. They used a cheap iron hoop, often corroded and worn, passed down through generations like a sad little family heirloom. So the symbol of eternal love was basically a flaking metal loop that stained your finger. It probably gave you tetanus. Picture a groom sliding a rusty iron ring onto his bride's hand, both lovingly ignoring the orange smudge it leaves behind on her skin. 71. The age gaps in medieval marriages were absolutely stomach-turning. It was considered completely normal for a 50-year-old widowed baron to legally marry a 12-year-old girl just to secure himself an heir. So a child barely out of playing with dolls got handed to a wrinkly old man for breeding purposes. Nobody batted an eye. Picture a terrified little girl standing beside a groom older than her grandfather, while the whole village treats this disturbing arrangement like a perfectly ordinary business decision. 72. Some regions were so obsessed with modesty that they regulated bedtime clothing. Even in bed, couples were required to wear linen shifts with very specific cutouts, all to avoid the terrible sin of vanity. So intimacy happened through a strategically holed nightgown, like some bizarre medieval onesie. Looking at your spouse fully was apparently scandalous. Picture two newlyweds fumbling around in awkward cutout pajamas, technically married yet still forbidden from actually seeing each other, all thanks to a deeply uptight clothing rule. 73. Because God was viewed as the ultimate legal authority, weddings barely needed any people present. A couple could technically marry with absolutely zero human witnesses, since the big guy upstairs counted as the only signature required. So two people could just exchange vows in an empty field and be fully legally wed. No crowd, no priest, nothing. Picture a couple secretly mumbling their promises completely alone, then strolling off totally married with only the sky and some confused sheep as their witnesses. 74. Sharing a drink could accidentally bind you for life in the eyes of the village. If a bride and groom sipped from the exact same goblet of wine at the same moment, the community instantly viewed them as spiritually locked together. So one casual shared sip carried enormous weight. You really had to watch who you clinked cups with. Picture two people innocently drinking from one goblet, only for the whole town to gasp and declare them practically married on the spot. 75. The legal marriage ages back then would horrify any modern parent. Boys at just 14 and girls at only 12 could legally marry without needing a single shred of parental permission or even their knowledge. So two kids could vanish, get hitched, and return fully wed before mom and dad even noticed. There was no adult approval required at all. Picture a pair of children sneaking off, exchanging vows, then casually informing their stunned parents that they are now officially married adults. 76. Brides from forest regions had a gruesome secret stitched into their underwear. They would sew a real wolf's tooth into their undergarments, fully believing it guaranteed they would give birth to strong, powerful sons. So, tucked away in their most private clothing was an actual predator fang. Comfort clearly was not the priority. Picture a bride walking down the aisle with a literal wolf tooth poking around in her undies, convinced this hidden animal part was her ticket to mighty baby boys. 77. Grooms sealed their financial merger by destroying perfectly good money. They would take a silver coin and split it clean in half with a chisel, handing one piece to the bride to symbolize their joined wealth. So, instead of a romantic gift, she got half a broken coin. It was basically a medieval friendship bracelet, but currency. Picture a groom proudly smashing a coin in two, presenting the jagged half to his bride like it was the most romantic gesture imaginable. 78. Stubborn noble daughters who refused to smile at their suitors faced a grim punishment. They were locked away in cold stone towers and fed only bread and water until they finally caved and accepted the arranged marriage. So a girl saying no basically earned herself a starvation timeout in a drafty turret. The family simply waited her out. Picture a defiant young woman glaring out a tower window, surviving on stale crusts, refusing to break, while her parents patiently bet on her hunger winning. 79. Medieval couples were forbidden from seeing each other in the most literal way possible. They were strictly banned from lighting any candles in the bedroom, specifically to stop them from ever looking at each other's bodies. So the whole marriage essentially happened in total pitch-black darkness. Romance was a guessing game by feel alone. Picture two newlyweds bumping around a completely dark room, forbidden from a single flicker of light, fumbling through their entire relationship like they are playing blindfolded hide-and-seek. 80. Remote coastal settlements got seriously creative when metal supplies failed to arrive. They carved their wedding bands straight out of whalebone and walrus tusks, turning sea creatures into symbols of eternal love. So, a bride proudly wore a chunk of dead whale on her finger. It was rustic, to put it kindly. Picture a groom slipping a thick ivory ring carved from a walrus tooth onto his bride's hand, both beaming over their slightly fishy-smelling token of devotion. 81. The morning after the wedding came with a mandatory cash transaction. Grooms had to pay a so-called morning gift to the bride's father the very next day, basically the final installment to officially finalize the marriage contract. So while the couple was still groggy in bed, Dad was already outside collecting his payment. Love came with a billing schedule. Picture a yawning groom handing over a pouch of coins to his new father-in-law at sunrise, sealing the deal like he just paid off a layaway plan. 82. A single slip of the tongue could erase an entire marriage. If a groom accidentally said the wrong middle name during his vows, the church could legally wipe the whole wedding from existence like it never happened. So one nervous stumble over a name meant the couple was suddenly unmarried again. The pressure to pronounce everything perfectly was brutal. Picture a sweating groom freezing mid-vow, terrified of fumbling a single syllable, knowing one tiny verbal trip could legally undo his entire wedding on the spot. 83. The bride's first step into the church carried enormous superstitious weight. If she accidentally entered the porch with her left foot first, the entire town immediately believed the marriage was completely doomed, so everyone watched her feet like nervous hawks during the most stressful entrance ever. One wrong step, and the whispers began. Picture a bride staring down at her own shoes, sweating bullets, desperately concentrating on leading with the right foot while the entire village holds its breath waiting. 84. Remarrying as a widow came with a hefty surcharge for the new husband. If she wed again, her fresh groom had to pay a steep fee directly to her late husband's family, just for the right to her estate. So the dead guy's relatives still got a cut of her future love life. Death did not stop the billing. Picture a new groom grudgingly handing money to his bride's former in-laws, basically buying out the previous husband's family before he could even enjoy his own wedding. 85. Young boys were sometimes shoved into marriage purely to protect family land. Lords forced these child grooms into unions, specifically to ensure their family's knightly estate did not revert back to the crown. So, a little boy got married off like a legal insurance policy for some acres of dirt. Romance was nowhere in the equation. Picture a confused young boy standing at the altar in tiny formal clothes, exchanging vows he barely understands, all to stop a king from snatching the family farm. 86. New mothers were placed under a long romantic lockdown after having a baby. Intimacy was completely banned for the entire stretch of time a mother spent nursing her infant, which could drag on for years. So the reward for breastfeeding was an extended forced break from her husband. The church basically scheduled her love life around feeding times. Picture an exhausted new mom juggling a hungry baby while the priest reminds her that romance stays off the table until the nursing finally ends. 87. Church floors hid a disgusting secret beneath the holy atmosphere. The ground was layered with old straw that often went unchanged for months, turning it into a breeding ground for biting fleas. So brides occasionally fainted dead away from the relentless flea bites attacking their ankles. The sacred building was secretly crawling. Picture a bride trying to glow through her vows while an army of hidden fleas feasts on her legs, until she dramatically topples over right in the middle of the ceremony. 88. A widow's second wedding came with a strangely distant setup. Her remarriage ceremony was frequently held while she peered through an open window, rather than standing face to face with her new groom. So instead of meeting at the altar, she got married through a window frame like a drive-through order. It was oddly impersonal. Picture a widow leaning out of a window exchanging vows with a man standing outside, both pretending this awkward window negotiation counts as a heartfelt romantic union. 89. Staying silent could legally marry you off without saying a word. If a priest asked a woman whether she took a man to be her husband and she simply said nothing, the law counted that silence as a firm yes. So a nervous, speechless woman could end up married purely by failing to object. Quiet meant committed. Picture a stunned woman opening her mouth to protest, hesitating for just 1 second too long, only to discover that her silence just legally locked her into marriage. 90. A bride's mother had a greasy ritual to guarantee her daughter's future wealth. She would smear lard all over the doorposts of the new home, fully believing it would help prosperity slide smoothly into the house. So the entrance was basically buttered up like a frying pan. Walking in meant dodging a slippery mess. Picture a new bride stepping into her home past doorframes dripping with pork fat, while her mother nods proudly, convinced she just lubricated the family straight into riches. 91. The word bridal comes from a wild medieval money-making scheme. The bride personally brewed huge batches of ale and then sold it to all the wedding guests, pocketing the cash to fund her new married life. So the celebration doubled as the bride's own pop-up beer stand. The more guests got drunk, the richer she got. Picture a bride hustling mugs of homemade ale across the feast like a medieval bartender, cheerfully overcharging her own relatives to bankroll the marriage. 92. Backing out of an engagement could legally cost a woman everything she owned. If she called off a formal betrothal, the groom's family was permitted to seize her personal belongings as a punishment for changing her mind. So cold feet came with a brutal financial penalty. Saying no meant kissing your stuff goodbye. Picture a woman bravely calling off the wedding, only to watch the groom's relatives march into her home and haul away her possessions as payback for daring to follow her heart. 93. The church kept official manuals listing exactly which bedroom positions were illegal. Breaking these oddly specific rules carried a punishment of 3 whole years of penance, surviving on bread and water. So priests were essentially writing detailed instruction guides on what not to do. Get caught, and you faced years of stale crusts. Picture a couple nervously consulting the church's forbidden list, terrified that one wrong move would sentence them to 3 miserable years of choking down dry bread and water. 94. The water in the baptismal font got treated like a supernatural alarm system. If it started bubbling during the wedding vows, the locals immediately believed an actual witch was lurking somewhere in the crowd. So everyone kept one nervous eye on the holy water at all times. A few bubbles could spark total panic. Picture an entire congregation suddenly whipping around mid-ceremony, pointing fingers and gasping, all because the font fizzed slightly, and now somebody must surely be a hidden witch. 95. Slavic brides were expected to keep completely quiet for the entire wedding day. From sunrise until the wedding night finally ended, the bride was forbidden from speaking even a single word out loud. So she floated through her own celebration in total enforced silence, like a beautiful mute statue. Not one peep was allowed. Picture a bride biting her tongue through hours of feasting and dancing, desperate to say something, anything, while everyone around her chatters and she just nods along silently. 96. A pig outbreak could legally cancel everybody's wedding plans. If a localized plague swept through the village pigs, the church was allowed to suspend all human weddings for a full month just to prevent crowds from gathering. So sick livestock could single-handedly shut down your romance. Couples got grounded because of swine. Picture a frustrated engaged pair staring at their dying village pigs, realizing those snorting animals just postponed their entire wedding for an extra 30 agonizing days. 97. A single bird could bring an entire wedding screeching to a halt. If one black crow landed on the church roof during the vows, the ceremony was immediately stopped so everyone could pray against incoming death. So the wedding's fate rested on the flight path of random birds. One feathered visitor meant total chaos. Picture a couple mid-vow when a crow plops onto the roof, instantly sending the whole crowd into a panicked group prayer to fend off the apparent omen of doom. 98. Families would happily destroy their finances just to throw an unforgettable party. They would bankrupt themselves for an entire generation to fund a 3-day wedding feast, all to prove their social standing to the nosy village. So future grandchildren paid the price for one epic blowout. Showing off was worth total ruin. Picture a family proudly hosting a lavish 3-day feast, stuffing every guest silly, while quietly committing their bloodline to decades of crushing debt just to look impressive. 99. The Celtic hand-fasting tradition occasionally took a much darker turn. While usually symbolic, the hand binding was sometimes used to physically tie a reluctant bride's wrists together during the long walk to church. So the romantic cord became an actual restraint, dragging her toward a wedding she did not want. Love had nothing to do with it. Picture an unwilling bride with her wrists bound, being led step by step toward the altar, while everyone pretends the rope is purely a sweet traditional gesture. 100. Daytime romance was strictly outlawed for a deeply judgmental reason. Sleeping together during daylight hours was considered illegal because it was viewed as shameful, animalistic behavior unfit for proper humans. So couples were essentially confined to the cover of darkness only. The sun coming up meant the bedroom closed for business. Picture two newlyweds glancing at the bright morning light, sighing, and accepting that the church has officially declared the daytime completely off-limits for anything remotely romantic. 101. In plague-struck towns, grooms got blindfolded for a grim practical reason. The cloth went over their eyes during the ceremony specifically so they would not back out if they suddenly spotted a bride's fresh skin lesions. So the wedding became a literal trust fall into the unknown. What you could not see could not scare you off. Picture a blindfolded groom reciting his vows in total darkness, completely unaware of what his bride actually looks like, just hoping the surprise underneath turns out okay. 102. Poorer wedding guests believed they could steal good fortune straight off the bride's dress. As the couple walked back from the church, guests would try to rip little threads right off her actual gown for personal good luck. So the bride basically got slowly unraveled by grabby well-wishers during her stroll home. By the end, she was practically in tatters. Picture a bride power-walking away from the church while desperate guests pluck at her dress, leaving her wedding gown looking like a chewed-up sweater. 103. Matchmakers had a bizarre method for judging a potential bride by inspecting her teeth. They would actually measure a woman's teeth before any proposal, genuinely believing that wide dental structures predicted she would have an easy childbirth. So a woman's marriage prospects depended on someone peering into her mouth like a horse trader. Big teeth meant big value. Picture a matchmaker prying open a nervous woman's lips, nodding approvingly at her wide chompers, then declaring her perfectly built for cranking out babies. 104. Brides in remote villages smeared themselves with fireplace ash for protection. They would rub soot all over their necks specifically to stop forest spirits from stealing their youth on the wedding day. So instead of glowing, the bride showed up looking like she lost a fight with a chimney. Beauty took a backseat to spirit defense. Picture a bride proudly covered in grimy ash, fully convinced the dark smudges on her neck were the only thing keeping sneaky forest spirits from snatching her youthful looks. 105. Poor couples even had to pay extra just to hear wedding bells. The church bell ringer charged a separate fee per single ring, meaning broke weddings got short, silent, rushed ceremonies. So the more coins you had, the more your love got celebrated in sound. No cash meant no chimes. Picture a poor couple standing in total awkward silence after their quick budget wedding, while down the road, a rich couple enjoys a glorious symphony of bells they actually paid for. 106. Conquered castles came with a brutal romantic catch for widowed noblewomen. The widows of lords were often forced to marry whoever stormed in and conquered their late husband's castle, simply to make the new ruler look legitimate. So winning the battle meant winning a wife she never chose. Her hand was basically part of the loot. Picture a grieving widow being marched toward the very warrior who just toppled her home, forced to wed him so the village accepts his shiny new ownership. 107. Couples were warned they had an invisible audience watching their wedding night. Church texts seriously claimed that personal guardian angels stood right at the foot of the bed, closely observing the couple's bedroom conduct. So intimacy came with the unsettling thought of heavenly chaperones taking notes. Privacy did not exist, even from the divine. Picture two newlyweds trying to relax while genuinely believing A pair of solemn angels are hovering at the bed's edge, silently judging every single move they make. 108. Scandinavian brides had to pass a salty endurance test before the wedding. They were forced to eat heavily salted fish for 12 hours straight without a single drop of water, all to prove their emotional stamina. So the path to marriage ran straight through a dehydration nightmare. Cracking from thirst meant failing the trial. Picture a parched bride choking down salty fish hour after hour, desperately resisting the urge to beg for water, just to prove she was tough enough to be a wife. 109. Crying at your own wedding feast could legally get you in trouble. Brides who shed tears during the celebration were officially reprimanded for supposedly bringing a curse upon the village's future crop harvest. So a single sob threatened everyone's dinner for the entire next year. The pressure to fake happiness was immense. Picture a bride biting back tears at her feast, forcing the widest fake grin imaginable, terrified that one stray teardrop will somehow ruin the whole village's wheat supply. 110. Small Italian mountain villages took wedding guest security very seriously. Out-of-town guests were legally required to submit their names to the local watchman, all to ensure no bitter blood feuds quietly slipped into the celebration. So, crashing a wedding meant clearing an official background check first. Strangers got logged like airport arrivals. Picture nervous out-of-town guests lining up to register with a stern watchman, who carefully checks each name, making sure no ancient family grudge sneaks in to ruin the party. 111. The historical records reveal a truly heartbreaking reality at many medieval altars. Priests frequently ignored brides who were actively weeping and screaming no during the vows, pressing forward with the ceremony regardless of her protests. So, her desperate refusals carried absolutely zero weight in the moment. Consent was simply not part of the equation. Picture a sobbing bride begging for it all to stop, while the priest calmly continues the ritual, treating her loud objections like background noise nobody intended to hear. And there you have it. 111 medieval wedding traditions so unhinged that your messiest family reunion suddenly looks downright peaceful. People got married over a sip of wine, ate dinner out of a toilet pot, and panicked over crows on the roof. And we complain about seating charts. So, if this made you grateful for indoor plumbing and basic human rights, smash that like button, subscribe to Dumb History so the algorithm stops ignoring us like a silent medieval bride, and comment which tradition horrified you the most. Now go hug your spouse and tell them you would never trade them for a herd of cows. Stay dumb, friends.